28,000 feet above the Rhine Valley on September 7, 1943, Oberleutnant Werner Schröer understood death was seconds away. The American P-38 Lightning behind him should have broken off pursuit 3,000 feet ago. Instead, tracer rounds stitched past his canopy as the twin-engine fighter followed him through a dive that violated every combat lesson learned over 3 years of aerial warfare. Schröer had executed the maneuver perfectly. Roll inverted, pull through into a vertical dive, watch the airspeed indicator sweep past 600 kilometers per hour. At these speeds, pursuing Allied fighters would lose control as shock waves formed over their wings, forcing them to break off or risk tumbling into an unrecoverable spin. Schröer had used this escape tactic dozens of times. It had saved his life in dogfights over North Africa, Malta, and now the skies of occupied Europe. But today, the P-38 stayed with him. The American pilot pressed his attack through speeds that should have locked his controls, diving at angles that defied the physics Schröer had trusted with his life. Something fundamental had changed in the air war, and German fighter pilots were about to pay a terrible price for assumptions that were no longer true. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Schröer couldn't know was that the Lightning pursuing him carried a modification so elegantly simple it seemed impossible it could alter the entire dynamic of aerial combat. Small aluminum flaps, extending from the wings in less than 2 seconds, had eliminated the P-38's most critical weakness. For 2 years, German fighter pilots had exploited the Lightning's compressibility problem, diving away from danger knowing the Americans couldn't follow. Now, suddenly, that sanctuary had vanished. The story of how American engineers solved this problem reveals an invisible war fought in wind tunnels and test flights where mathematics and metal transformed tactical reality. It demonstrates how a single modification, costing mere thousands of dollars per aircraft, could render obsolete combat tactics developed through brutal experience. Most significantly, it shows how American industrial flexibility and willingness to innovate created advantages that Germany's rigid doctrines could never counter. To understand what changed in autumn 1943, we must first understand the deadly problem that had plagued the P-38 Lightning since its earliest combat deployments. The issue stemmed from fundamental physics that aviation engineers were only beginning to comprehend in the early 1940 seconds. When an aircraft dives at high speed, airflow over certain parts of the wing accelerates beyond the aircraft's actual velocity. This happens because air must travel farther over the wing's curved upper surface than across the flat lower surface. At high dive speeds, this accelerated airflow can approach the speed of sound, even though the aircraft itself is flying much slower. Aviation engineers call this regime transonic flight, the dangerous twilight zone between subsonic and supersonic speeds. At transonic velocities, the normal rules of aerodynamics break down catastrophically. Shock waves form where the airflow suddenly decelerates from supersonic to subsonic speeds. These shock waves disrupt the smooth flow of air over the wing's surface, creating turbulence and dramatically altering the pressure distribution that generates lift. For the P-38 Lightning, these shock waves created a problem that could kill. As the aircraft accelerated in a dive, shock waves forming near the wing's leading edge shifted the center of pressure backward. This rearward shift created an uncontrollable nose-down pitching moment. The pilot would find his control stick effectively locked in the forward position. No amount of pulling could raise the nose. The aircraft would continue diving, steeper and steeper, accelerating toward the ground. The phenomenon was first documented dramatically during spring 1941, 2 years before Schröer's encounter over the Rhine. Major Signe Gilkey was conducting high-altitude performance tests at Wright Field, Ohio, pushing a P-38E through its paces at 30,000 feet. The Army Air Forces needed comprehensive data on the Lightning's capabilities before committing to mass production. Gilkey's job was to find the aircraft's limits. During a steep dive to test maximum speed characteristics, Gilkey watched his airspeed indicator pass 320 miles per hour. Suddenly, the aircraft's tail began shaking violently. Before Gilkey could react, the nose dropped sharply, and the dive steepened to nearly vertical. The Ohio countryside rushed up at him with terrifying speed. Gilkey pulled back on the control yoke with all his strength. The stick barely moved. He might as well have been pulling against a steel bar welded in place. The Lightning continued its plunge toward Earth, accelerating through air that grew denser with every 1,000 feet of altitude lost. Gilkey's altimeter unwound rapidly. 25,000 feet, 20,000, 15,000. At this rate, he had perhaps 8 minutes before impact. In those 8 minutes, Gilkey experienced every pilot's nightmare. He was strapped into an aircraft that refused to respond to his commands, diving toward certain death. He tried everything he'd been taught, reducing throttle, deploying flaps, even considering bailing out. But at these speeds, opening the canopy would likely tear it off, and ejection seats didn't exist yet. At lower altitudes, where air density increased, Gilkey finally regained marginal control authority. He pulled back on the yoke with desperate strength, accepting G-forces that grayed his vision and crushed him into his seat. The Lightning's nose rose slowly, grudgingly. Gilkey pulled out of the dive at less than 5,000 feet, his hands shaking, his flight suit soaked with sweat. When he landed, Gilkey's after-action report was stark. Aircraft entered uncontrollable dive at approximately 450 miles per hour, indicated airspeed. Control stick frozen forward. Recovery possible only at lower altitudes through extreme pilot force and dangerous G-loading. Recommend immediate investigation before aircraft enters combat service. Lockheed's legendary chief engineer, Kelly Johnson, recognized immediately that this wasn't a simple design flaw that could be fixed with minor adjustments. The P-38 was encountering the edge of transonic flight, a regime where normal aerodynamic rules broke down in ways that aviation science barely understood in 1941. Johnson contacted the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the predecessor to NASA, requesting urgent wind tunnel testing to understand what was happening to airflow over the Lightning's wings at high speeds. NACA possessed the most advanced wind tunnel facilities in the world, capable of generating airflows approaching the speed of sound. If anyone could diagnose the problem, it was NACA's aerodynamicists. NACA's response shocked Johnson. The organization refused to conduct high-speed wind tunnel tests on the P-38, claiming that the shock waves generated might damage their expensive wind tunnel facilities. This refusal, born of bureaucratic caution and budget concerns, would cost American lives for the next 2 years. Without wind tunnel data, Lockheed engineers had to rely on flight testing to understand the problem, a dangerous and time-consuming process. Test pilots pushed P-38 seconds into progressively steeper dives, carefully documenting when control problems began, how they progressed, and what conditions allowed recovery. Each test flight risked the pilot's life. Several test pilots came within seconds of death exploring the boundaries of the compressibility envelope. Through careful analysis of flight test data and consultation with leading aerodynamicists, Johnson's team gradually pieced together what was happening. At high dive speeds, airflow accelerated over the curved upper surface of the P-38's wing, reaching transonic velocities, even though the aircraft itself was flying well below the speed of sound. The shock waves that formed disrupted the normal pressure distribution, moving the center of lift aft and creating the violent nose-down moment that had nearly killed Major Gilkey. The math was brutally simple. A P-38, diving from typical combat altitude of 25,000 feet, would reach critical compressibility speeds around 450 miles per hour, indicated airspeed in approximately 4 minutes of steep dive. From that point, the pilot had perhaps 8 minutes to recover before hitting the ground, assuming he maintained enough consciousness and control authority to pull out at all. Many pilots didn't. By 1942, when P-38 seconds began entering combat in significant numbers over North Africa, Europe, Lockheed had identified the problem but not yet developed a solution. The company distributed technical bulletins to fighter squadrons, explaining the compressibility phenomenon and warning pilots to avoid steep dives at high speeds. But in combat, pilots couldn't always control when they needed to dive. Enemy fighters appeared above them, forcing them down. Or they pursued fleeing German aircraft, following them into dives that became death traps. German intelligence quickly learned of the P-38's weakness through combat reports and interrogations of captured American pilots. Luftwaffe technical officers conducted systematic debriefs of every German pilot who encountered P-38 seconds, collecting data on the Lightning's performance characteristics, strengths, and vulnerabilities. By mid-1942, Luftwaffe tactical officers distributed explicit instructions to fighter units across the Mediterranean and European theaters. When pursued by P-38 Lightnings, execute a half-split S maneuver and continue into a steep dive. The Americans will be unable to follow due to aircraft limitations. Maintain dive until clear of pursuit, then recover at low altitude. This became standard doctrine throughout the Jagdwaffe. Fighter pilots practiced the escape maneuver until it became instinctive. When bounced by P-38 seconds, roll inverted, pull through into a vertical dive, and watch the Americans break off pursuit. Training officers drilled the procedure into new pilots before they saw combat. The Lightning cannot follow you down. Use this when you have no other option. Analysis of combat reports from North Africa showed the tactic worked with remarkable consistency. German fighters successfully escaped using dive tactics in approximately 65% of engagements where the maneuver was attempted. The remaining 35% failed mostly because pilots executed the dive too late, already damaged, or at too low an altitude for effective escape. The psychological impact on P-38 pilots was profound and corrosive. They learned through bitter experience that their quarry could escape at will simply by diving. This knowledge affected decision-making in combat. Pilots hesitated before pressing attacks, knowing the German fighter could roll away and dive to safety. Some American pilots stopped pursuing altogether once a German fighter entered a dive, having watched squadron mates lose control and crash while trying to follow. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, experienced the compressibility problem firsthand over France in early 1943. Pursuing a Focke-Wulf Fairview 190 that had just attacked his wingman, Johnson followed the German fighter into a steep dive. At first, the Lightning responded normally, accelerating smoothly as altitude decreased. Then, passing 450 miles per hour indicated airspeed, Johnson felt the first warning signs. The control stick began to feel heavy in his hands, as though the hydraulic system was failing. The aircraft's nose wanted to drop further despite his back pressure on the yoke. Johnson immediately recognized what was happening. He'd been briefed on compressibility before deploying to Europe. Johnson had perhaps 6 minutes before losing all control. He reduced power immediately and deployed his dive brakes, slowing the aircraft enough to regain control authority. But by that time, the Telview 190 had escaped, pulling out of its dive several thousand feet below and racing away at low altitude. Johnson returned to base, frustrated, knowing he'd had the German pilot dead to rights until the Lightning's compressibility problem forced him to break off. After his mission debrief, Johnson asked his squadron's engineering officer when Lockheed planned to fix the dive problem. The engineering officer shook his head. "They're working on it. That's all I know. Until then, don't follow Germans into vertical dives unless you want to dig yourself a hole in France." Similar incidents occurred daily across P-38 units, in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Europe. German pilots learned they possessed a guaranteed escape tactic, an insurance policy that could be activated whenever they found themselves in trouble. This knowledge emboldened aggressive German pilots while demoralizing American aviators who understood their aircraft's critical weakness. The tactical implications extended beyond individual dogfights. P-38 squadrons had to modify their entire approach to combat. They couldn't pursue fleeing enemies through vertical dives. They had to set up attacks carefully, trying to catch German fighters in positions where diving wasn't an option at low altitude, or with obstacles below that made recovery impossible. This constrained P-38 effectiveness at a critical time. In 1942 and 1943, the Allies desperately needed air superiority over Europe to support the planned invasion of France. P-38 seconds, with their long range and heavy armament, should have been ideal for escort missions deep into Germany. But their compressibility problem meant German fighters could often escape when pressed, limiting the Lightning's ability to clear the skies. German fighter pilots developed sophisticated tactics around the P-38's weakness. They would engage American formations at high altitude, make a single attacking pass, then dive away before the escorts could respond effectively. Luftwaffe tactical manuals from 1943 show explicit instructions: against P-38 seconds, maintain altitude advantage when possible, attack from above, make one pass, dive to escape. Do not attempt sustained combat at medium altitudes where the American aircraft performs well. Major Günther Roll, a German ace who would survive the war with 275 confirmed victories, later described the tactical calculus. We knew the Lightning was faster than our aircraft in level flight. We knew it was more heavily armed. But we also knew that in a vertical dive, we could escape whenever we chose. This knowledge was worth more than speed or firepower. It meant we could break off combat when things went badly, live to fight another day. This German advantage came at no cost. They didn't need special equipment or modifications. They simply dove, using the P-38's own physics against it. American pilots, meanwhile, flew aircraft that betrayed them at high speeds, locking their controls and threatening to kill them if they pressed their attacks too aggressively. Unknown to frontline pilots on either side, Lockheed engineers had been working on a solution since early 1943. Kelly Johnson understood that the fundamental problem was the rearward shift of the center of pressure during high-speed dives. If engineers could find a way to shift the center of pressure forward again, they could restore elevator authority and give pilots back control of their aircraft. The challenge was finding a solution that could be manufactured quickly, installed on existing aircraft, and that wouldn't compromise the P-38's performance in normal flight regimes. Johnson's team explored numerous options, modifying the wing's airfoil shape, adding fixed aerodynamic surfaces, even redesigning the tail surfaces to provide more pitch authority. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. One of Johnson's young engineers, studying pressure distribution data from wind tunnel tests conducted on P-38 wing sections, noticed that disrupting airflow at specific locations could shift the center of pressure. What if they could deliberately create turbulence in precisely the right spot to counteract the shockwave effects? The solution Johnson's team developed was elegantly simple: small flaps that deployed from the underside of each wing, positioned approximately at mid-chord, halfway between the wing's leading and trailing edges. Unlike normal flaps used for landing, which extended from the wing's trailing edge, these dive recovery flaps deployed from the middle of the wing's lower surface. The positioning was critical. When extended, the flaps disrupted airflow in precisely the right location to shift the center of pressure forward, counteracting the nose-down moment created by shock waves on the wing's upper surface. The flaps were relatively small, only about 8 inches wide and extending to 35 degrees when fully deployed. But their effect on the aircraft's behavior was transformative. In February 1943, Lockheed test pilot Tony Levier conducted the first flight tests of the dive recovery flaps at Burbank, California. Levier was one of America's most experienced test pilots, a man who had pushed dozens of experimental aircraft through their performance envelopes. But even he approached this test with unusual caution. The modification was so simple, it seemed implausible it could solve a problem that had killed pilots and grounded one of America's most important fighters from aggressive combat. Levier climbed to 25,000 feet in a specially modified P-38, the California coast, stretching below him in the morning sun. He ran through his pre-dive checklist, ensuring all instruments were functioning properly. Then he rolled the Lightning into a vertical dive, pointing the nose straight down toward the Pacific Ocean. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, 200 miles per hour, 300, 350. Levier felt the familiar sensation of acceleration pressing him forward against his harness straps. 400 miles per hour. Now came the critical moment. At 420 miles per hour, Levier felt the first warning signs: slight buffeting in the tail, the control stick beginning to feel heavier. He flipped the switch that deployed the dive flaps. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Instead of the control stick freezing and the nose dropping uncontrollably, as it would in an unmodified P-38, Levier felt normal control response return. He pulled back smoothly on the yoke, and the Lightning's nose rose obediently. The dive flaps had shifted the center of pressure, forward just enough to restore normal control authority. Levier checked his instruments. The dive flaps had deployed in approximately 1.5 seconds, extending to their full 35-degree angle. Airspeed: 450 miles per hour and still climbing. Controls: responsive. Aircraft attitude: stable. He continued the dive, accelerating past 500 miles per hour speeds, where an unmodified P-38 would be in an unrecoverable plunge. At 520 miles per hour, Levier pulled into a smooth recovery, experiencing manageable G-forces rather than the violent, vision-graying pullout that characterized recoveries from compressibility-induced dives. The Lightning climbed back toward altitude, controls functioning perfectly throughout the maneuver. Levier's voice came over the radio to the engineers monitoring from the ground. "It works. It actually works. I had full control authority through the entire dive. No buffeting, no stick lock, nothing. This modification solves the problem completely." He climbed back to altitude and repeated the test multiple times, varying the dive angle and the speed at which he deployed the flaps. Every test confirmed the solution worked perfectly. The dive recovery flaps provided immediate pitch control recovery at any speed where compressibility effects occurred. Test data showed that with flaps deployed, a P-38 could maintain controlled flight at speeds significantly higher than without them, as much as 575 miles per hour in some test profiles. The path from successful test flights to combat deployment faced immediate and tragic challenges. Lockheed manufactured over 200 retrofit modification kits designed to be installed on P-38J, 10 and J-20 models, already serving in Europe. These kits contained all the necessary hardware, the flap assemblies themselves, electric motors to deploy them, control switches, wiring harnesses, and detailed installation instructions. In March 1944, these precious kits were loaded aboard a Douglas C-54 Skymaster transport aircraft for shipment to England. The C-54 took off from California, heading east across the United States and then over the Atlantic. It carried not just the modification kits, but also technical representatives who would oversee the installation program at bases across England. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The C-54 never arrived. Over the Atlantic, an RAF pilot on patrol spotted what he believed to be a German Focke-Wulf Faf 200 Condor maritime patrol bomber. The Condor was a four-engine aircraft the Luftwaffe used for long-range reconnaissance and anti-shipping strikes. Allied pilots were under standing orders to engage Condors on sight. They provided valuable intelligence to German U-boats hunting Allied convoys. The RAF pilot attacked immediately, closing to firing range and opening fire with his machine guns. The transport's engines erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled over, plunged into the grey Atlantic waters. Only then did the RAF pilot realize his terrible mistake. The aircraft he'd destroyed wasn't a German Condor, it was an American C-54, and the silhouettes were similar enough that in poor visibility, misidentification was tragically possible. All aboard were killed, and the precious cargo of dive flap modification kits sank into the North Atlantic. This friendly fire incident destroyed months of production work and delayed field modifications for P-38 seconds already in combat by at least 4 months. The loss came during a critical period. German fighter opposition was still formidable in spring 1944. Luftwaffe pilots were using their dive escape tactic daily, slipping away from P-38 attacks that should have ended in victories for American pilots. Every day of delay meant more German fighters escaped, more combat sorties ended in frustration, more American bomber crews died because Luftwaffe fighters survived to attack again. Tony Levier had travelled to England, in late 1943 on a 4-month morale-boosting tour of P-38 bases. His mission was to demonstrate the new dive flaps to combat pilots and show them that relief from the compressibility problem was coming. The loss of the modification kits meant Levier was demonstrating capabilities that frontline pilots wouldn't receive for months. Despite this cruel irony, Levier's demonstrations proved transformative for pilot morale. At bases like King's Cliff, home to the 20th Fighter Group, Levier flew a specially modified P-38 named Snafu Spare One that had been upgraded to P-38J25 specifications with full dive flap capability. Word spread quickly when Levier arrived. The test pilot who had proven the dive flaps worked was here to show them what the Lightning could do. On a clear morning in January 1944, dozens of pilots gathered at the flight line to watch. Levier taxied out, performed his pre-flight checks, and climbed smoothly toward altitude. At 25,000 feet, he rolled the Lightning into a vertical dive, pointing the nose straight down toward the English countryside. The watching pilots expected to see Levier pull out of the dive early, as all P-38 pilots had learned to do. Instead, the Lightning continued its vertical plunge, accelerating to speeds that should have locked the controls. The aircraft grew smaller and smaller, diving at an angle that made experienced pilots wince and shake their heads. Several men muttered that Levier had miscalculated, that he'd left his recovery too late, that they were about to witness a test pilot kill himself. Then, at less than 5,000 feet, Levier pulled smoothly out of the dive, the Lightning's nose rising with apparent ease. The aircraft executed a perfect recovery, climbing back toward altitude without any sign of struggle or excessive G-loading. For emphasis, Levier climbed back to altitude and performed several low-level victory rolls. The P-38's distinctive twin booms silhouetted against the grey English sky. The demonstration electrified every pilot present. They had been told that new P-38 seconds would have dive flaps that solved the compressibility problem, but seeing Levier's demonstration made it real and immediate. The Germans' escape route could be closed. The tactic that had frustrated them for 2 years could be neutralized. Pilots rushed to debrief Levier afterward, crowding around him with urgent questions. When do we get the modified aircraft? How long until the modification kits arrive? Can they be installed on the J-10 seconds we're flying now? Levier explained that P-38J25 models with factory-installed dive flaps were already rolling off the production line in Burbank and would begin reaching European bases within months. But privately, Levier knew about the lost C-54. He knew that retrofit kits for existing aircraft had been destroyed. The pilots asking him these eager questions would have to wait longer than they hoped, flying vulnerable aircraft while German pilots continued exploiting the dive escape tactic daily. Back in California, Lockheed worked frantically to maintain production while incorporating the new modification. The company faced competing pressures. The Army Air Forces desperately needed P-38 seconds for the upcoming invasion of Europe, but they needed P-38 seconds with dive flaps, not vulnerable aircraft that German fighters could escape from at will. P-38Js coming off the assembly line in spring 1944 were towed out to the ramp and modified in the open air, with workers installing dive flap assemblies on aircraft that were otherwise complete. It was inefficient and slowed production, but it was faster than redesigning the entire assembly line. Engineers worked around the clock preparing new production specifications. The dive flap assemblies had to be integrated into the manufacturing process rather than installed as aftermarket modifications. Suppliers needed to deliver motors, flaps, wiring, and control switches to match production schedules. Every delay meant more pilots flying without the modification. The flaps were finally incorporated directly into the production line in June 1944 on the last 210 P-38J aircraft built. These were designated P-38J25 seconds, and they represented the culmination of 3 years of struggle against the compressibility problem. From initial problem identification to combat deployment, the dive recovery flap program had taken approximately 28 months, an eternity in wartime, but remarkably fast considering the technical challenges involved. By August 1944, P-38J2, 5 fighters with factory-installed dive recovery flaps, began reaching combat units in meaningful numbers. The 55th Fighter Group, based at Wormingford, England, received the first batch of modified aircraft. Pilots who had flown earlier P-38 models for months approached the new aircraft with curiosity mixed with skepticism. They had heard promises before about fixes and improvements. They'd believed the dive flaps worked when they tested them personally. Captain James Morris, a veteran pilot with 11 confirmed victories, took one of the first P-38J 25 seconds on a test flight to explore the dive flap capabilities. He climbed to 30,000 feet over the English Channel, the morning sun glinting off the Lightning's polished aluminum skin. Then he rolled into a dive aimed at the empty ocean below. Morris watched the airspeed indicator climb past 400 miles per hour, the speed where earlier P-38 seconds would begin exhibiting compressibility effects. He continued diving, accelerating past 420, 450, approaching 500 miles per hour. The channel rushed up at him, the water's surface resolving into individual waves. Morris felt the first signs of buffeting, the initial warning that shock waves were forming over the wings. His hand moved to the dive flap switch on his control yoke. He flipped it. The flaps deployed with a barely perceptible shudder, extending to their full 35-degree angle in 1.5 seconds. Instantly, Morris felt the nose-down pressure on his control stick disappear. He pulled back smoothly, and the Lightning responded immediately, the nose rising in a controlled arc. Morris completed his recovery at 10,000 feet, his vision clear, his control responses normal, experiencing none of the violent forces that characterized recoveries from compressibility-induced dives. Morris climbed back to altitude and repeated the test, this time continuing the dive even deeper before deploying the flaps. The results were identical. No matter how fast he dove or how steep the angle, deploying the dive flaps restored immediate control authority. The modification worked exactly as advertised. When Morris landed, he sought out his squadron commander and delivered his assessment in 3 words: the problem solved. The change in combat dynamics was immediate and profound. Within days of P-38J 25 seconds reaching combat units, German pilots began reporting that American fighters were following them through dive maneuvers that should have been impossible. Initial reports were dismissed as pilot error or exaggeration. Perhaps the Americans were simply taking greater risks, accepting dangerous G-loads to maintain pursuit. But the reports kept coming. From fighter units across the Western Front, Luftwaffe pilots described P-38 seconds, maintaining perfect control in vertical dives, following them to altitudes where recovery should have been impossible. Technical intelligence officers began paying closer attention. Oberleutnant Werner Schröer, the same pilot who had been shocked by aggressive P-38 behavior over the Rhine in early September, encountered the modified Lightnings again on September 12th during an escort mission protecting B-17 bombers attacking oil refineries near Merseburg. Schröer led a section of 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109G 6 seconds in a diving attack on the bomber formation's rear elements. The attack succeeded in damaging 2 B-17 seconds, flames streaming from one, bomber's No. 3 engine. But P-38 escorts immediately responded, turning hard into the German fighters. Schröer executed his standard escape. Roll inverted, pull through into a vertical dive, accelerate to maximum speed. His Bf 109 dove steeply, the airspeed indicator sweeping past 600 km per hour. Schröer felt the familiar confidence of the dive escape. In seconds, he'd be clear of pursuit, free to climb back to altitude and rejoin his formation. He glanced back, expecting to see the P-38 seconds breaking off pursuit. Instead, 2 Lightnings followed him down, diving at angles that should have triggered compressibility lockup. The Americans maintained perfect control, their aircraft tracking Schröer's every maneuver. He continued diving past 7,000 meters altitude, then 6,000, approaching the point where he would need to begin recovery to avoid hitting the ground. The P-38 seconds closed to firing range. Schröer saw muzzle flashes from their nose-mounted weapons, tracer rounds reaching toward him like glowing fingers. He made an instant decision. Rather than continue diving, which clearly wasn't working, he would execute an early pullout and try to lose the Americans in low-altitude maneuvering where the Bf-109's agility gave him advantages. Schröer pulled hard on his control stick, accepting the massive G-forces required to pull out of a high-speed dive. His vision grayed at the edges, blood draining from his head as his body experienced over 6 Gs of acceleration. The Bf-109 shuddered but obeyed, the nose rising slowly as Schröer fought to maintain consciousness. His gi suit inflated, squeezing his legs to prevent blood from pooling in his lower body, but it wasn't enough to prevent significant vision degradation. Behind him, the P-38 pilots deployed their dive flaps and pulled into smooth recoveries, experiencing manageable G-forces rather than the violent pullout that Schröer endured. They maintained visual contact with the German fighter and continued their pursuit at low altitude. Schröer, barely conscious from his violent recovery, pushed his throttle to maximum power and raced for cloud cover. He escaped that day through superior knowledge of local terrain and aggressive low-altitude flying, but 3 of his wingmen did not. The P-38's had followed them through dives that should have guaranteed safety, maintaining pursuit all the way through recoveries and continuing combat at low altitude. That evening, Schröer filed a combat report noting that American P-38's now appeared capable of controlled diving at speeds previously impossible. He recommended immediate investigation to determine what modification the Americans had made. His report was serious and urgent. The Americans have solved their compressibility problem. Our primary escape tactic is no longer effective. Recommend immediate revision of tactical doctrine for all fighter units. German technical intelligence officers, added Schröer's, report to a growing file of similar accounts from pilots across the Western Front. Within weeks, German intelligence examined wreckage from several shot-down P-38's and discovered the dive recovery flaps. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, and detailed reports compiled for distribution to fighter units and aircraft manufacturers. Technical officers explained how the flaps worked and why they gave American pilots such a decisive advantage in high-speed diving maneuvers. The explanation was clear and technically accurate. What they couldn't explain was how to respond. By autumn 1944, Germany's deteriorating industrial situation prevented any meaningful response to the American modification. The constant Allied bombing campaign had disrupted production facilities and supply chains across the Reich. Factories that manufactured aircraft components operated on irregular schedules, dependent on sporadic deliveries of raw materials, and increasingly vulnerable to precision bombing raids. Resources that might have been devoted to developing similar modifications for German fighters were instead consumed by desperate attempts to maintain existing production levels. The Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories were developing new aircraft variants, the Me-262 jet fighter, improved versions of the Bf-109 and FW-190, but copying the American dive flap system was impossible, given the constraints they faced. Even if German engineers designed equivalent dive recovery flaps, manufacturing them required machine tools, skilled workers, and production capacity that Germany no longer possessed in sufficient quantities. Every aircraft that rolled off German assembly lines in late 1944 represented a minor miracle of improvisation and determination. Adding new systems to these aircraft was beyond the capacity of an industrial base that was visibly collapsing. The strategic implications were devastating for the Luftwaffe. For 2 years, the dive escape had served as a reliable, last-resort tactic for German fighter pilots. It was their insurance policy, the maneuver they could rely on when overwhelmed or caught in disadvantageous positions. Now, suddenly, that escape route was closed. German pilots had to completely revise combat tactics that had been drilled into them through hundreds of training hours and combat sorties. Tactical directives issued to fighter units in October 1944 reflected this new reality. When engaged by P-38 Lightnings, avoid diving escapes unless absolutely necessary. If forced to dive, execute shallow-angle dives rather than vertical plunges. Be aware that P-38's can now follow through any dive maneuver and should be treated as equals in all flight regimes. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and demoralizing. The dive escape had represented certainty in an increasingly uncertain war. Now that certainty was gone, removed by a modification so simple that captured American pilots described it almost apologetically. Just small flaps under the wings, they deploy electrically, takes about a second and a half. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with over 200 victories, encountered the modified P-38 seconds in late October 1944 during a desperate attempt to intercept a bomber stream heading toward Munich. Baer led a formation of 12 Bf-109G 14 seconds against more than 150 B-17 seconds, escorted by perhaps 60 P-38 seconds and P-51. Mustang's odds that would have been unthinkable in 1942, but had become routine by late 1944. The German fighters made a single slashing attack through the bomber formation, damaging several B-17 seconds, but immediately finding themselves engaged by swarming American escorts. Baer shot down one P-38, his cannon shells hitting the Lightning's right engine and starting a fire that quickly spread to the wing. But 3 more P-38 seconds immediately converged on his position. Baer dove away, rolling his Bf-109 into a steep plunge that had saved his life countless times before. He knew immediately that something was wrong. The P-38 seconds followed him down without hesitation, maintaining formation discipline even as the dive steepened. Baer continued diving, accelerating to maximum speed, pulling out only when he reached 3,000 feet altitude. When he looked back, the P-38 seconds were still there, having followed him through the entire maneuver with perfect control. Baer escaped only by racing at low altitude through a narrow valley where the American pilots, unfamiliar with the terrain and unwilling to risk collision with hillsides, chose not to follow. After landing, Baer wrote in his personal log, "The Americans have closed the last advantage we possessed. With superior numbers, improved tactics, and now the ability to follow through any escape maneuver, they have achieved complete air superiority. The war in the air is lost." Statistics from American fighter groups showed dramatic improvements in combat effectiveness after the introduction of dive recovery. Flaps. The 55th Fighter Group, which had been flying P-38 seconds since October 1943, saw its victory-to-loss ratio improve by nearly 40% after receiving P-38J-25 aircraft. Combat reports showed successful enemy escapes, using dive tactics dropped from approximately 60% before dive flaps to less than 20% afterward. The 20th Fighter Group, based at King's Cliff, documented the change even more dramatically. In the 3 months before receiving dive flap-equipped aircraft, the group claimed 43 enemy aircraft destroyed while losing 19 P-38 seconds in aerial combat, a ratio of 2.3 to 1. In the 3 months after receiving P-38J 25 seconds, they claimed 71 enemy aircraft destroyed, while losing only 11 Lightnings, a ratio of 6.5 to 1. The dive flaps didn't explain all of this improvement. German pilot quality was declining across the board as experienced veterans were killed and replaced by inadequately trained newcomers. Fuel shortages grounded increasing numbers of German fighters. Allied numerical superiority grew overwhelming, but the dive flaps contributed significantly to the changed outcomes, eliminating the Germans' most reliable defensive tactic at precisely the moment when they most needed any advantage they could get. Individual pilots experienced the difference directly. Lieutenant Robin Olds, who would become one of America's most legendary fighter pilots, flew both early and late model P-38 seconds and documented the stark contrast. In July 1944, flying a P-38J without dive flaps, Olds pursued a Bf-109 that dove away from an engagement over France. Olds followed initially but was forced to break off when compressibility effects made control difficult. The German pilot escaped, and Olds returned to base frustrated. 2 months later, now flying a P-38J-25 with dive recovery flaps, Olds encountered a similar situation over Western Germany. A Focke-Wulf Foal 190 dove away after a brief engagement. This time, Olds followed without hesitation, deploying his dive flaps as his airspeed increased. The Lightning responded perfectly, maintaining control through a dive that reached nearly 520 miles per hour indicated airspeed. Olds closed to firing range and destroyed the Fellview 190 with a short burst from his nose-mounted 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns. The kill that had been impossible in July became routine in September. Olds wrote in his combat diary, "The dive flaps have transformed the Lightning from a compromised fighter into a dominant one. German pilots no longer have anywhere to run. The transformation was complete. The 8-minute window that German pilots had relied on the time it took for a diving P-38 to reach compressibility speeds and lose control had closed forever. Small aluminum flaps and electric motors had eliminated Germany's last reliable escape route, accelerating Luftwaffe defeat when the Reich could least afford it. The legacy of the P-38 dive recovery flaps extends far beyond World War II combat statistics. The program generated fundamental data about transonic flight control that influenced aircraft design for decades. When Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 on the 14th of October 1947, the aircraft incorporated lessons learned from P-38 compressibility research. Aviation historians later identified the dive flap program as generating more useful data about transonic flight control than any other single program of World War II. In those 8 minutes between entering a dive and losing control, German pilots had found sanctuary. In 1.5 seconds of flap deployment, American engineers took that sanctuary away. The war's outcome was never in doubt by late 1944, but the dive recovery flaps accelerated the end, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not the most complex, but the most elegantly simple solutions to critical problems. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.